Nobody on Caldwell Road could quite explain what Willa Hollister was doing. She was 9 years old. She carried a green plastic bucket, the kind farmers used for feed, and inside it, wrapped in damp newspaper, were seedlings. Not many. 20, maybe 30 at a time. She walked from the back porch of the farmhouse down the long gravel drive, past the mailbox with the peeling red flag, past the split-rail fence her grandfather had built in 1962, and she turned east into the low ground where the drainage ditch cut across the corner of the property. She knelt in the mud. Her jeans hand-me-downs from her older brother Jesse were already brown at the knees before she started. She pulled a seedling from the bucket, made a small hole in the bank with her bare fingers, pressed the root ball down, tamped the soil firm with a flat river stone she kept in her pocket. Then she pulled out a leatherbound notebook, the kind you buy at the feed store for keeping track of cattle weights, and she wrote something down. The date, the location measured in paces from the old cottonwood at the north end of the ditch, the species, the soil moisture, whether the sun was on the bank or behind cloud. She was 9 years old, and she was doing something her father, Cal Hollister, did not fully understand. Something her mother, Corinne, watched from the kitchen window. With quiet worry, something the neighbors 2 properties over would slow their pickup trucks to see. Delphine Kellerman told her husband Merl she thought the girl was trying to pretty up the ditch. Give the old drainage line some character. Merl glanced over the wheel of his Ford, snorted once, and kept driving. That's what happens, he said, when a girl grows up with no sisters and too many books. Delphine didn't answer. She had learned in 41 years of marriage when not to answer. Nobody thought Willa Hollister was doing anything wrong. Nobody thought she was doing anything important. They thought she was a quiet child playing at gardening, planting tall grass along a muddy ditch, because she'd seen a picture in a magazine, because that was what a girl her age did when she had time on her hands. They were wrong. They were wrong for 3 years. If you love true stories about ordinary people solving extraordinary problems on working farmland, stay with me. This is one of them. And it begins, as most of these stories do, with a child who noticed something the adults had stopped seeing. The Hollister family had farmed the same 280 acres in Warren County, Iowa, since Cal's grandfather, Owen Hollister, put a down payment on the land in the spring of 1938. With money he'd earned selling off a herd of Guernsey dairy cows further north. Corn and soybeans in the main fields rotated on a 2-year cycle. A small herd of black Angus cattle on the north pasture. A kitchen garden behind the house that Corinne kept going from April to October, with a stubbornness that no late frost had ever quite defeated. Warren County sits in the south-central part of Iowa, 40 minutes down from Des Moines. The land rolls gentle in most places, corn on the higher ground. Soybeans on the flat, but along the lower edge of the Hollister property, the terrain sagged toward a natural drainage corridor. A long winding ditch that carried runoff from the fields down toward Middle Creek, half a mile east. Iowa receives an average of 35 inches of rain a year. Most of it falls heavy and fast in spring and early summer, in the kind of storms that turn a Tuesday afternoon dark as evening and leave the county roads shining wet by nightfall. For farmers, a drainage ditch is both a blessing and a problem. It carries water off the fields, saves the crops from standing rot. But it also carries something else, something the farmers rarely stop to think about because they had been raised not to. It carried the farm itself, one grain of soil at a time. Willa had been watching that ditch since she was 6 years old, not playing near it, watching it. After every hard rain, she crouched at the bank in her yellow rubber boots and studied the water. She noticed the way it ran fast in the channel, cutting a line down the center where the flow was strongest. She noticed the color brown and silted heavy in a way that plain water wasn't. And she noticed how the muddy stream seemed to carry something with it as it moved. She noticed how the banks had grown lower and wider over the years, how the edges crumbled a little more each season, how the mouth of the ditch where it emptied into Middle Creek had spread from something you could jump across when Cal was a boy to something wide enough now that Willa had to walk around it. Her father called it normal. Ditches move, he told her once when she asked. He was standing in the mudroom peeling off wet boots after a spring shower. He didn't look at her when he answered. Always have, always will. Land breathes Willa. Don't go making a project out of it. She wrote that down too. Not the part about ditches moving. The part where her father didn't look at her when he said it. She had, at 6 years old, already begun to notice the difference between what adults said and what adults believed. The spring Willa turned 8. A wet April sent 2 inches of rain in 40 minutes across the county. It was the kind of storm the old-timers called a gully washer. Sheets of water came off the corn stubble so fast the fields glistened like flooded rice paddies for a full hour after the rain stopped. The Hollister fields survived. The corn had not yet been planted, and the ground, though saturated, held. The ditch did not hold. A 20-foot section of the west bank collapsed sometime in the night, and by morning the runoff had cut a new channel sideways through the corner of the lower soybean field. Cal walked out at first light with his coffee still steaming in his hand, and stopped at the edge of the collapse, and he did not drink his coffee, and he did not move for a long time. 4 inches of topsoil, across nearly half an acre, gone. Downstream, toward the creek, toward the river, toward eventually the Gulf of Mexico, though. Cal Hollister did not think in those terms. He thought in terms of what his grandfather Owen had built. He thought in terms of the dark, rich earth that took 100 years of prairie grass and 40 years of careful crop rotation to make. He thought in terms of what was now gone in a single night. He hired Ellsworth Baird, a neighbor with a small excavator, to come out that weekend and reshape the bank. Ellsworth was 70 years old, chewed a matchstick instead of tobacco, and had done this same work on a dozen farms across Warren County over the years. He graded the slope. He pushed the loose earth back into something that resembled the original contour. He tamped it firm with the bucket of the machine, and he collected $200 and he drove home. Cal thanked him. Cal paid him in cash from the coffee can in the kitchen cupboard. Cal walked back out to the ditch after Ellsworth's truck was gone, and then he went inside and moved on. That was what a farmer did. You lost something. You fixed what you could. You moved on. Willa did not move on. She stood at the edge of the repaired ditch after her father went inside, and she stared at the exposed subsoil, the pale, compacted earth where the dark topsoil had been. She pressed her small foot against it hard. It did not give. It was dry even after 2 inches of rain. It was wrong. She was 8 years old, and she understood in the wordless way that children sometimes understand things. Adults have forgotten how to see that the problem had not been fixed. The bank had been reshaped, but nothing was holding it. Nothing would be holding it the next time. That night, after supper, after her brothers Jesse and Tanner had gone up to their shared room to argue about a football game, after her mother had turned on the small radio on the kitchen counter and let the AM voice of a Des Moines announcer read out the weather for the week ahead, Willa slipped away to her room, closed the door quietly, and reached under her bed. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook. It was not new. She had been keeping it for 2 years. On the inside cover, in the careful, oversized handwriting of a first grader, she had written her name and beneath it 3 words, "The Water Book." The pages were filled. Maps of the ditch drawn from memory, from angles no adult had ever thought to draw them from. Color codes for the water: brown, red, brown, tan, clear. Measurements of the bank taken with a yardstick she had smuggled out from under the couch. Dates, times, weather. The names of the seasons written across the top of each month like chapter titles. There were 3 years of data in the notebook. 3 years. She had been 6 years old when she started it. Nobody knew. Not her father, not her mother, not her brothers, not her grandfather. Though her grandfather would soon become the only person in the world who understood what the notebook meant. Willa opened to a fresh page. She wrote the date. April 14th. She wrote the amount of the storm. 2 inches 40 minutes. She wrote the length of the collapse. 20 feet. She wrote the depth of the loss. 4 inches. She wrote in the shaky handwriting of a child working past her bedtime by the yellow light of a bedside lamp one final line. The fix is not a fix. Then she closed the notebook and slid it back under her bed and lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods along the drive. That autumn, when the corn came down and the fields went brown, and the sky over Warren County took on the flat gray look it kept from October to March, Willa began asking questions. She started with the one person in her family who still remembered farming from before the ditches had grown so wide. Her grandfather, Silas Hollister, was 73 years old. He had been a science teacher at Indianola High School for 35 years. Retired in 2010 and now lived in the small clapboard house set back 30 yards from the main farmhouse. The house Owen Hollister had built for himself in 1951 when he moved out to make room for Cal's father to raise a family. Silas had inherited it when his own wife Willa's grandmother passed in 2018. He lived there alone now, with a wood stove that he still fed by hand, and a garage that no car had entered in 15 years, because the garage was where he kept everything else. Books, filing cabinets, weather journals going back to 1974, boxes of student lab reports he had never quite been able to throw away. And in the far corner, under a canvas tarp, a cardboard box marked in black Sharpie, USDA Bulletins 1970s to 80s. Willa knocked on his door on a Saturday in late October. Silas answered in a plaid flannel shirt tucked into brown work pants, silver hair combed back, reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. He looked down at his granddaughter. She was holding the notebook. He did not ask why. He stepped aside and let her in. They sat at the small kitchen table by the wood stove, and Willa opened the notebook and she showed him. 3 years. Silas Hollister turned the pages slowly. He put his reading glasses on and took them off twice. He touched once the careful diagram of the West Bank collapse she had drawn from memory the morning after the April storm. He touched once the color chart she had made to track the sediment in the runoff. He read without speaking the small notation in the margin of one page, dated a full year before the collapse. West Bank getting lower. Ask Dad. And beneath it, in different ink, dated 3 months later, Dad said, "Ditches move." Silas Hollister closed the notebook. He took his reading glasses off. He looked at his granddaughter for a long time. Then he stood up, walked out to the garage, and came back carrying the cardboard box. He set it on the table between them. "You want to know what's happening to that ditch?" he said. His voice was low, even the voice of a man who had spent 35 years explaining hard things to children. "I'll tell you what's happening, but first you need to read what men smarter than me were writing about it 40 years ago, because they knew, and nobody listened." Willa opened the box. Yellowed pamphlets, USDA extension bulletins, faded blue covers, titles in a plain typewriter font. Vegetative filter strips for agricultural runoff, riparian buffers and bank stabilization, native grass establishment on working farmland. She did not understand most of the words on the first page. She copied them into the back of her notebook anyway, every one. And then she looked up at her grandfather and asked him what a filter strip was. Silas Hollister took a slow breath. He was quiet for what felt to Willa like a long time. Then he said, "I need to tell you something, Willa. And I don't want you to tell your father just yet. Not because it's a secret, but because he's not ready to hear it." She nodded. She was 8 years old. She had already, without knowing it, become the keeper of one family's secret. In 1978, her grandfather said, "I was 27. I'd come back to help my father on this farm the year before. I was already teaching at the high school, but I was reading everything the USDA was putting out. All of this." He gestured at the box. "I read about filter strips. I read about switchgrass. I read about what was happening to the topsoil in Iowa. And I decided I was going to plant the west bank of that ditch." Willa did not move. "I bought the seed. I ordered plugs from a nursery up near Ames. I had it all planned out. And when my father found out what I was doing, he stopped me. He came out to the ditch on a Saturday morning with a spade in his hand, and he told me I was not going to plant weeds on his farm. He said this land was corn and beans and cattle. He said grass belonged in the pasture and nowhere else. He said a real farmer did not need a college book to tell him how to keep his soil in his fields. Silas looked down at his hands. I was 27 years old. He was my father, and I put the seed away. He was quiet. 45 years ago. Willa did not speak. She had understood in the space of one sentence that she was not the first person in this family to think about the ditch. She was the third. Owen Hollister had built the farm. Silas Hollister had tried to save it and been stopped. And now Willa, 8 years old, sat at a kitchen table by a wood stove holding a notebook full of 3 years of secret data. And her grandfather was telling her the story of a defeat he had carried alone for 4.5 decades. Silas stood up. He walked to the corner of the kitchen where a set of old hand tools hung on nails driven into the wall. He took down a short-handled planting hoe with a worn ash handle and a rusted blade. He came back and set it on the table beside the notebook. I bought this in 1978, he said. I was going to use it to plant the bank. I never did. I want you to have it. Willa reached out and touched the handle. The wood was smooth where his hand had held it. She did not say thank you. She understood that this was not a gift you thanked someone for. She carried the hoe home in one hand and the notebook in the other. And she walked past her father, who was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the wind move through the cottonwoods. And he looked at what she was carrying. And he did not ask. He would not ask for another 2 years. That March. The March she turned 9, Corinne Hollister drove her daughter into Indianola to the Warren County office of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Because Willa had asked in the specific and quiet way she asked things whether her mother could take her. Corinne had assumed it was a school project. She was wrong. The NRCS office was on the second floor of a low brick building on the west side of town, above an insurance agency and a shuttered barber shop. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled like copier toner and old carpet. Corinne waited in a plastic chair by the door and watched her daughter walk into the office of a man named Dell Marsh. Dell Marsh was 55 years old. He had spent 30 years working with farmers on soil conservation across 3 Iowa counties. He wore Wrangler jeans and a green quarter-zip pullover with the NRCS logo on the chest. He had a gray mustache and slow, careful eyes. And when Willa walked in and set her notebook on his desk and told him she wanted to talk about her family's drainage ditch, he did not smile the way adults smile at children who are trying to seem grown up. He nodded. He said, "Show me." She showed him. Dell Marsh looked at the notebook for a long time. Then he sat back in his chair. "How old are you?" 9 next month. "How long have you been keeping this?" "Since I was 6. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the notebook. Then he stood up, walked to a file cabinet and pulled out a stack of pamphlets. He set them on the desk in front of her. "You want to know why your ditch is losing soil?" he said. "I'm going to tell you, because you've already done more work than half the farmers who come through this door." He drew her a diagram on a legal pad. He drew the ditch in cross-section. He drew the water moving through it. He drew the way fast water cuts down and out, undermining the bank from below. He drew what happens when the vegetation on the bank is thin and shallow-rooted, the way most cool-season grasses are the way lawn grass and pasture grass are. Then he drew what happens when the bank is planted with something else. Native prairie grass, switchgrass, a big blue stem, eastern gamma grass. He drew the roots, 6 feet deep, sometimes 8. He drew the way the roots grip the soil like fingers gripping sand. He drew the way the tall stems above the ground slowed the incoming water, creating friction, forcing the water to spread out sideways instead of cutting downward, forcing it to drop the sediment it was carrying before it could leave the property. "It doesn't stop the flood," Dell Marsh said. "You can't stop a flood, but you can slow it down. And slowing water down is everything. Every farmer who ever kept his topsoil kept it by slowing the water down." Willa wrote every word. Before she left, Dell mentioned that the NRCS ran a native plant assistance program, reduced cost grass plugs for exactly this kind of conservation work. He said he could set some aside for her. She said yes. Corinne, still waiting in the hallway with her purse in her lap, watched her daughter come out of the office holding a stack of pamphlets and a legal pad with a diagram on it, and a receipt for a plug order that Corinne had not authorized. She did not say anything. She drove her daughter home. That night at supper, Willa did not mention the trip. Cal did not ask. Corinne watched her husband across the table and thought about the notebook she had once seen briefly on the kitchen counter, and thought about the fact that her 9-year-old daughter had spent 45 minutes in the office of a soil conservationist and had come out with a plan. She did not tell Cal. Not yet. Willa began planting in April. She got up before school in the grey half-light of 5 in the morning, and she carried the bucket of seedlings down to the ditch. And she knelt in the cold mud and pressed the plugs into the bank with her bare hands. Her fingers blistered on the second day. She wrapped them in medical tape and kept going. She planted before school. She planted on Saturdays from sunup until Corinne called her home for supper. She planted through the light spring rain. She planted through the mosquito hatch in early May. She kept the notebook in the back pocket of her jeans and pulled it out after each session to record what she had done where and how the soil had felt. Her brothers Jesse and Tanner offered to help once. Jesse was 12. Tanner was 14. They lasted 40 minutes before Jesse got a blister, and Tanner decided the mud was ruining his sneakers. Willa did not argue with them when they left. She just kept going. The neighbors kept driving past. Delphine Kellerman, from behind the wheel of her white Buick, still smiled and waved and told her husband Merl she thought the little Hollister girl was just trying to pretty up the ditch. Merl, who had never been polite about anything in his life, was less kind. He was down at the Miller's Diner in Indianola one Saturday morning when Cal came in for coffee. Merl was at the counter in his usual seat with 3 other men his age. He looked up when Cal walked in and raised his voice just enough to make sure Cal heard. "Cal, I hear your little girl's out there trying to save Iowa with weeds." The other men laughed. Cal did not respond. He walked past Merl without looking at him, sat down 2 stools away, and ordered his coffee. He drank it slowly. He did not say a word. When the check came, Cal reached into his back pocket and pulled out enough cash to cover his own coffee and Merl's breakfast, and the coffee of the 2 other men at the counter. He set it on the counter without a word. He stood up. He walked out. Merle Kellerman watched him go and did not laugh again. Cal Hollister drove home the long way that morning. He did not stop at the ditch. He did not need to. He had known for weeks what his daughter was doing. He had seen the pamphlets on the kitchen table. He had seen the notebook once left open on the counter while Willa washed her hands. And he had read the top page before she came back. And he had closed it and walked outside and stood on the porch for a long time. He had not said a word to her. He did not know how. He was a man who had been raised by a man who had been raised by another man. And none of them had known how to say to a child, "I see what you are doing and I do not understand it, but I trust you." So he said nothing. He did what farmers in his family had always done when they did not know what to say. He watched. That night, after Willa had gone to bed, Cal sat on the front porch with a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, and Corinne came out and sat beside him in the second rocking chair, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. A whip poor Will called from somewhere down by the ditch. "She's got your father's hoe," Corinne said finally. Cal did not answer for a moment. Then he said, "I know. Silas gave it to her." "I know." Corinne looked over at her husband. He was staring out at the dark line of the ditch, invisible now, in the falling night, marked only by the darker line of the cottonwoods that grew along it. "She's like him, Cal." He did not answer. "She's like your father." Cal Hollister set his glass of tea on the porch rail. He put his hands on his knees. He looked for the first time in a long time at the shape of his own hands, calloused and dark. The hands of a man who had spent 12 years at the John Deere plant up in Uncanny before he came home to take over the farm when his own father got too old to run it alone. He looked at his hands for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I don't know what she's doing out there." And Corinne said just as quietly, "You don't have to know yet." They sat on the porch in the dark. The weep, poor Will called again. Somewhere down at the ditch in soil that had been bare for 120 years since the last of the tall grass prairie had been broken by a plow. The first roots of switchgrass planted by the hands of a 9-year-old girl were pushing quietly downward into the earth. Nobody could see them. Nobody would see them for a long time. But they were growing. The summer Willa turned 9 was the hottest Warren County had seen in 11 years. The Des Moines forecasters started calling it a heat dome by the second week of June. The corn was still short ankle high in the fields, and it stood in its rows like a green army waiting for orders that never came. The sky went pale. The wind stopped moving. The soil, which had been wet and rich in April, began to crack along the edges of the driveway where the sun hit it hardest. Willa was up at 5 every morning. She carried 2 buckets, now one full of seedlings, one full of well water. She walked the length of the ditch before school in the flat white light of early dawn, and she poured a careful cup of water at the base of every plug that looked like it was struggling. Switchgrass, big bluestem, eastern gamma grass. She talked to none of them. She simply watered them one by one, moving down the bank in a slow rhythm that anyone watching from the road would have taken for a form of prayer. By the second week of July, a third of the upper bank switchgrass had gone yellow. Willa recorded it in the water book. She did not cry. She did not tell her father. She wrote a note to Dell Marsh instead on a sheet of school notebook paper, and she asked her mother to drop it at the NRCS office the next time Corinne drove into Indianola for groceries. Corinne read the note before she delivered it. It was 3 sentences long. It asked which cultivar of switchgrass held up best in drought on upper bank soil, and it thanked Dell for his time. Corinne dropped the note off. Dell wrote back the same day. He suggested a variety called cave-in rock developed in the 1950s for exactly this kind of stress. He said he could get plugs by the end of the month. Willa replanted the failed sections in late August. Her hands, which had healed from the spring blisters, blistered again. She did not complain. She was by this point the sort of child who no longer expected the world to make her work easy. She had learned at 9 years old that the world was neutral, that the water did not care whether she was tired, that the sun did not care whether her knees were bruised, that the switchgrass did not care whether it was August and hot, and she was hungry for supper. The plants had their own logic. Her job was to learn it. That was what her grandfather had told her one evening on the porch of the small clapboard house, while the two of them sat drinking iced tea Corinne had brought over in a mason jar. Silas had been quiet for a long time before he spoke. He had been holding his glass with both hands the way old men hold glasses when their fingers ache. "The land will teach you," he said, "if you let it. Most farmers don't let it. They tell the land what to do. They plant what the seed company sends them, and they spray what the co-op tells them to spray, and they harvest what the market pays for, and they never stop to ask what the land is trying to say back." He looked at her. "You're asking?" Willa did not answer. She was 9 years old, and she did not yet know how to answer a thing like that. She just nodded. Silas nodded back. The Angus cattle found the new planting on the 3rd Tuesday of August. There were 16 head in the north pasture that summer, and one of them, a 5-year-old cow the family called Number 9, because of the ear tag she had worn since she was a calf, discovered that the strip of tender young grass along the ditch bank was more interesting than anything in the pasture proper. She led the others through a low spot in the fence line where a cottonwood root had heaved the wire up over the years. They walked the bank 3 mornings running before Cal noticed. Willa noticed first. She came out at 5 on a Wednesday and saw the damage. 20 feet of switchgrass freshly planted crushed flat. The soil compacted where the cows had stood. The stems broken at the base. 2 full days of work gone. She did not go inside and tell her father. She sat down on the bank. She put her forehead on her knees. She stayed there for a long time. The sun came up over the corn. A meadowlark called from somewhere out in the pasture. Willa lifted her head, wiped her face with the sleeve of her flannel shirt, and pulled the water book from her back pocket. She wrote what had happened. She measured the length of the damage. She noted which sections were fully lost and which might recover if the roots underneath had not been compressed too severely. Then she stood up and walked back to the house. She did not tell Cal at breakfast. She told him after supper when the two of them were alone on the porch, and Corinne had gone upstairs to fold laundry. She told him plainly. Cal listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he did not speak for a moment. He looked out across the yard toward the dark line of the ditch, the way he had looked at it 100 times before without seeing it. He set his glass of tea on the porch rail. He put his hands on his knees. "I'll help you fix the fence," he said. That was all. They fixed it the next morning. Cal drove the pickup down the drive with a coil of galvanized wire and a fence stretcher in the bed, and Willa walked beside the truck carrying the fence post pounder. They worked for 2 hours. Cal cut the old wire. Willa handed him the new. He tightened it strand by strand along the low spot where the cottonwood root had heaved the ground. He did not say much. When they were done, he stood back and tested the tension with his hand, and he nodded once, and he put his tools back in the truck. Willa said, "Thank you." Cal said, "You're welcome." That was the whole conversation. But that afternoon, while Willa was at the kitchen table doing her math homework, Cal drove the pickup into Indianola without telling her where he was going. He drove to the farm supply store on Highway 65. He walked in past the seed corn display and the aisle of animal warmer and the rack of Carhartt jackets, and he went to the counter and asked the clerk, a woman named Ida, who had known him since high school, whether they carried native grass plugs. Ida said they did, from a nursery over near Boone. Cal ordered 200. He paid with cash from his wallet. He asked Ida not to tell anyone he had come in. Ida looked at him over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Cal Hollister, I've been keeping farmers' secrets in this store for 31 years. I'm not about to start telling now." Cal thanked her. He drove home the long way. He did not tell Willa. He did not tell Corinne. The plugs arrived the following Friday. The delivery truck came at 11 in the morning while Willa was at school. Cal met it in the drive, signed the paperwork, and carried the flats of seedlings around behind the barn, where he covered them with an old canvas tarp against the sun. That evening after supper, while Willa was upstairs, Cal walked out to the ditch and set the flats down on the bank at the far north end. He left them there. He walked back to the house. He did not say a word. Willa found them the next morning at 5. She stood on the bank in the gray dawn light and looked at the 200 plugs of switchgrass sitting in the wet grass. And she looked up toward the farmhouse where the kitchen window was lit, and her father was standing at the sink with his back to the window drinking coffee. She did not go to the house. She did not thank him. She understood. She got down on her knees and started planting. That was the way things worked between Willa and Cal Hollister from that summer forward. He did not ask her what she was doing. She did not tell him. He noticed what she needed. She noticed what he provided. Neither of them said a word about any of it. That was how her father knew how to love her, and that in time was how she came to understand that she was loved. There are men in this country who would call that kind of love insufficient. Willa Hollister, at 9 years old, understood that it was the deepest kind of love the Hollister men had ever learned to give. She took it. She kept working. The confrontation at Miller's Diner came in October. It was a Saturday morning. The corn had come down 2 weeks earlier. The fields were brown and flat. Cal had gone into Indianola to pick up a hydraulic hose for the combine, and he had stopped at Miller's for coffee on the way home, the way he always did on a Saturday morning. Merl Kellerman was at the counter with 4 other men. They were all in their 50s and 60s, farmers most of them. A retired county extension agent named Warren Holloway, a grain elevator operator from the co-op named Dwayne Ostrander, Merl's brother-in-law, a beef cattleman named Rex Feltman who lived up near Milo, and a man Cal did not know well, a corn and hog farmer from the west side of the county named Hollis Grabowski. Merle saw Cal come in. He waited until Cal had ordered his coffee. Then he said loud enough for the whole counter to hear, "Cal, tell me something. Is it true your little girl is out there planting weeds along your ditch bank?" The other men looked up. Cal set his coffee cup down. He did not turn to face Merle. He looked straight ahead at the pie case behind the counter. "She's planting native grass," Cal said. "Native grass," Merle said. He laughed. "That's a nice word for it." Warren Holloway, The retired extension agent cleared his throat. He was 78 years old and he had spent 40 years of his career trying and failing to get the farmers of Warren County to plant filter strips along their drainage ditches. He said, "Merl, that's not weeds, that's a conservation practice." Merle said, "It's a 9-year-old girl playing in the mud, Warren. Let's not dress it up." The men laughed. Not all of them. Warren did not laugh. Dwayne Ostrander did not laugh. But Rex and Hollis laughed, and Merle laughed loudest of all. Cal Hollister stood up. He picked up his coffee cup and carried it 2 stools down and set it on the counter next to where Merle was sitting. He took out his wallet. He counted out enough cash to cover his own coffee and Merle's breakfast, and the coffee of every other man at the counter. He set the money down on the linoleum next to Merle's plate. He looked at Merle for the first time since he had walked in. "My daughter," Cal said, "is smarter than every man at this counter, including me." He turned and walked out. The bell over the door jingled behind him. Nobody at the counter spoke for a long moment. Then Warren Holloway said quietly to no one in particular, "That girl might be right." Merle Kellerman did not answer. He looked down at the money on the counter. He did not touch his breakfast for a full minute. Cal drove home without stopping. He parked the pickup in the yard and walked into the house and hung his hat on the peg by the door and sat down at the kitchen table without a word. Corinne was at the counter kneading bread. She looked at her husband. She saw his face. She did not ask. She poured him a fresh cup of coffee. She set it in front of him. She went back to her bread. Cal drank the coffee in silence. Willa upstairs in her room was writing in the water book. She did not know and would not know for another 11 years that her father had defended her honor at the counter of Miller's Diner that morning. She would only learn about it decades later at Warren Holloway's funeral, when the old man's grandson would come up to her at the reception and tell her the story his grandfather had told him 20 times before he died. But something in the house shifted that afternoon. Corinne felt it. She could not have said what it was. She only knew that her husband, who had spent months watching his daughter through the kitchen window, without speaking of it, had made a decision. He was going to stand behind her, publicly, whatever it cost him. Silas Hollister died on the 23rd of September in his sleep. He was 73 years old. Corinne found him in the morning when she brought over his breakfast the way she had every morning for the 6 years since his wife had died. He was in his bed. His reading glasses were on the nightstand. A book was open on his chest, a paperback copy of Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac, which he had been reading for the 12th time. He had not been sick. His heart had simply stopped. Willa was 10 years old. She did not cry at the funeral. She stood next to her father in a black dress her mother had bought her at a shop in Indianola, and she watched the pastor read from the book of Ecclesiastes, and she watched Merl Kellerman, who had come to the funeral in a dark suit, stand at the back of the church with his cap in his hands. She watched the men from the community college where Silas had once taught summer courses stand together in a row and take turns speaking about him. She listened to all of it. She did not speak. When they lowered the casket into the ground at the small cemetery east of Indianola, Willa stepped forward. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a dried stem of switchgrass 12 inches long, brown and papery, harvested from the north end of the ditch 2 days earlier. She dropped it onto the top of the casket. She stepped back. Cal Hollister saw her do it. He saw the switchgrass on the wood of the casket. He saw his 10-year-old daughter step back into her place beside him, with her hands folded in front of her. He understood in that moment everything he had failed to understand for the past 4 years. He put his hand on the top of her head. He left it there. That was the only physical affection he had given her, in front of anyone since she was small enough to lift. She did not move. She did not look up. She let his hand stay. 3 days after the funeral, Corinne went to Silas's house to begin the work of sorting through his things. Cal drove Willa to school and then joined her. They spent the whole day in the small clapboard house working through the closets, the filing cabinets, the boxes in the garage. In the top drawer of the desk in Silas's bedroom, Corinne found an envelope. It was addressed in Silas's careful teacher's handwriting to Willa Hollister. Corinne did not open it. She brought it home that evening and set it on the kitchen table in front of her daughter. Willa opened it after supper alone in her room. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper folded in thirds, a hand-drawn map. Old. The paper was so old that the folds had begun to soften and tear at the edges. The ink was faded. The map showed a section of drainage ditch marked with elevation notes and root zone diagrams. It showed a bank planting plan. It showed in the corner a name and a date. Emmett Rourke, April 12, 1962. There was a note clipped to the map in Silas's handwriting. Willa. Emmett Rourke was a friend of mine when I was a boy. He was 30 in 1962, farming 40 acres east of Milo. He tried to do on his ditch what you are doing on ours. His father stopped him. He gave me this map in 1978 when he heard my father had stopped me too. He asked me to keep it in case someone in the next generation was willing to finish what neither of us could. That someone is you. I have carried this for 45 years. It is yours now, Grandpa. Willa read the note twice. She read it a third time. Then she sat on the floor of her bedroom with the map in her hands, and she did not move for a long time. She was not the first. She was not the second. She was the third in a chain of 3 that stretched back 60 years, and she was the first who was going to be allowed to finish. That night in the water book on a fresh page, she wrote a single line. I'm doing this for 3 men I have never met. She underlined it. She closed the notebook. She turned off the light. She lay in her bed in the dark and listened to the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the drive. And she understood at 10 years old that her work was no longer only her own. Winter came. The switchgrass and big blue stem along the ditch turned brown and brittle. The stem stood up through the snow that fell in December, dry and rustling in the wind, looking to anyone driving past like nothing more than weeds that a farmer had neglected to mow. Merl Kellerman drove past twice a week on his way into town. He did not laugh anymore. He looked. Below the snow, below the frozen surface of the bank, the roots kept growing. 3 years now, some of them reaching down past 4 feet. The soil that had once crumbled at a touch was bound now into a living matrix threaded through at every depth with the slow, patient work of prairie plants, doing what prairie plants had done in Iowa for 10,000 years before the plow came. Willa spent that winter reading. She read everything Silas had left her in the boxes in the garage. She read the USDA bulletins from the 70s. She read the newer material Dell Marsh had sent her over the fall printouts from Iowa State University research on root biomass and carbon sequestration, and the way native grasses stabilize stream banks in ways that no engineering solution had ever matched. She sat at the kitchen table after supper with the water book open beside her, and she took notes. Corinne came in one Sunday evening in February to say goodnight, and found her daughter still at the table at 11 p.m., surrounded by pages of research papers she should not have been able to read at 10 years old. Taking careful notes in the margins of a printout about root biomass carbon sequestration. Corinne did not send her to bed. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She watched her daughter's careful hand moving across the page. She watched the small furrow between her daughter's eyebrows, the same furrow Silas had made when he read. She watched the pencil pause. She watched Willa turn the page. Then Corinne went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time that night. She lay in bed beside her husband, who was already snoring. And she stared at the ceiling. And she thought about her daughter. And she thought about what it was going to cost her daughter over the coming years to be the kind of person she was already becoming. Spring came again. The snow melted. The ditch ran high with runoff for 3 weeks in late March. The switchgrass and the big blue stem, still brown, still dormant, held the bank through the melt without a single crumb of soil giving way. By the first week of June, the new growth was 3 feet tall. By the second week of July, it was 5 feet tall. By August, the bank of the ditch from the old cottonwood at the north end to the low corridor, where the water emptied toward Middle Creek, was a continuous wall of living green. The stems overlapped, the leaves interlocked. The sound of the wind moving through it was not the sound of a lawn or a pasture. It was the sound of something older. Dell Marsh drove out on a Saturday in the 3rd week of August. He walked the length of the bank without speaking. He stopped twice. He knelt once to press his hand flat against the soil at the base of a switchgrass plant. He looked at the density of the stem count per square foot. He looked at the way the water in the channel, even after a mid-August thunderstorm 2 nights earlier, was running clear. He walked back to where Willa was standing. She was 11 years old now. She had grown 4 inches over the winter. She stood with her hands in the back pockets of her jeans and her hair in a loose braid over her shoulder. And she waited for him to speak. Dell took his cap off. He held it in his hands. "Willa," he said, "I've been doing this work for 31 years. I have never seen a bank this well established at this age. Never." Willa did not answer. "There's a conservation conference in Des Moines in October," Dell said. 200 farmers agents researchers. I want you to come and speak." Willa looked at him. "I don't give speeches," she said. "I know," Dell said. "I'm not asking you to give one. I'm asking you to stand up in front of them and answer questions. That's all. I'll do the talking. You just answer what they ask." Willa was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "All right." The conference was held on the 3rd Saturday of October at a hotel ballroom in downtown Des Moines. 211 people registered. The room was full by 9 in the morning. Dell introduced Willa at 10:15. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the youngest conservation farmer I've ever worked with, Miss Willa Hollister of Warren County." Willa stepped up to the microphone. She was 11 years old. She was wearing a plain white blouse and a corduroy jumper her mother had ironed the night before. She adjusted the microphone down to her height. She said, "Thank you for saying that, but that's not quite right. I'm not a conservation farmer. I'm somebody who watched the water long enough to understand what it was taking. That's all." She looked out at the room. 211 adults looked back at her. At the back of the room, in the last row, in a gray sport coat he had not worn in 12 years, Cal Hollister sat in a chair he had slipped into 10 minutes earlier, without telling his daughter or his wife that he had driven up from Warren County to be there. He watched his 11-year-old daughter answer questions from a room full of grown men and women for the next 40 minutes. She answered every question. She did not fumble. She did not stumble. When a soil scientist from Iowa State asked her a question about root exudates and microbial soil aggregation that even Dell Marsh had to think about, Willa answered it in 3 sentences and then quoted the paper she had read the answer in. The room at the end gave her a standing ovation. Cal did not stand. He could not. He sat in his chair in the back row with tears running down his face, and he did not wipe them away, and no one in the room noticed him. And that was the way he wanted it. He drove home before she did. He did not tell her he had been there. She would not find out for 6 years when Dell Marsh mentioned it in passing during a visit to the farm. By then she would understand. The rain began on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of May. It did not come the way spring storms in Iowa usually came, in sudden gully washes that broke fast and moved on. It came slow. It came patient. It came the way an old man walks into a room he knows he's going to stay in for a while. Willa was 12 years old now. She stood at the kitchen window in the late afternoon and watched the gray sheet of rain settle over the fields. And she did not need to look at the barometer on the wall by the mudroom door to know what she was looking at. She had been reading the sky for 6 years. She had learned to read it the way her grandfather Silas had once read student essays, slowly, carefully watching for the small tells that revealed what was really being said. The sky was saying this was the beginning of something. For 10 days the rain did not stop. Not hard, not violent, just steady, patient, saturating rain that came down through the nights and dripped from the eaves of the barn and pooled in the low places between the corn rows where the crop had just begun to show green. The ground drank what it could. By the 4th day, it had stopped drinking. Water stood in the field furrows. The pasture on the north end went spongy underfoot. The creeks began to run high and fast, the color of coffee with too much cream. Cal walked the property every morning and every evening. He did not speak much during those 10 days. He did what Hollister men had always done in the face of weather they could not control. He kept his boots by the door. He checked the fence lines. He moved the Angus cattle up to the higher pasture on the 8th day. And he did it alone because Jesse was down in Ames finishing his first year of community college, and Tanner was working the late shift at the ethanol plant in Newton. Willa walked the ditch every morning before school, every evening after supper. She walked its full length in her yellow rubber boots and her father's old canvas barn coat, which came down almost to her knees now that she had grown into it. She checked the switchgrass. She checked the big blue stem. She checked the eastern gama grass along the wetter sections at the south end. She pressed her palm flat against the soil at the base of the plants and felt the way the roots had bound the earth into something that no longer crumbled at a touch. 3 years of roots, 6 feet deep in some places, deeper. She wrote in the water book every night. On the 10th day, the National Weather Service upgraded the forecast from a flood watch to a warning. 48 hours of storm, 7 inches of rain predicted across Warren County. The largest single event in 30 years. Cal came into the kitchen after supper on the 10th night and stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hand. Corinne was at the sink. Willa was at the table with the water book open in front of her, marking the rain totals from the previous days in careful columns. "They're calling for 7 inches, Cal said. Corinne turned off the water. "Starting tonight," Cal said, "through Thursday." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Willa said, without looking up from the notebook, "The ditch will hold." Cal looked at his daughter. She was 12 years old. She was sitting at the kitchen table in a flannel shirt 3 sizes too big, one that had belonged to her grandfather. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid. She had a pencil behind her ear. She looked in that moment more like Silas Hollister than any Hollister who had ever lived. Cal did not answer. He set his hat on the peg by the door and went upstairs to lie down for a few hours before the storm came. The storm came at 11. It came the way the forecasters said it would come. A slow, heavy front that moved in from the west and stalled over Warren County like a hand pressing down on the land. The rain fell in sheets. The wind rose, then settled into a steady push out of the south. The gutters on the farmhouse ran full within an hour. By midnight, the yard was a shallow lake. Willa did not sleep. She sat by the window in her bedroom, with the water book in her lap, and watched the darkness outside. And she listened. She could hear the water moving. Not just falling, moving, running in sheets off the cornfield behind the barn, running down the gravel drive, pooling and finding its way toward the low ground where the ditch was. At 2 in the morning, Cal Hollister came to her door. He knocked once. He opened it. He stood in the doorway in his flannel pajama pants and his undershirt, his hair mussed from an hour of half sleep, and he looked at his daughter sitting by the window with the notebook open in her lap. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he walked across the room and sat down on the edge of her bed. He put one large calloused hand on her shoulder. He did not squeeze. He did not pat. He just left it there, warm and heavy, the weight of a father's hand. They sat like that for a long time. The rain hit the window in wind-driven waves. At 3 in the morning, somewhere down at the north end of the county on Ellsworth Bed's property, an old drainage ditch cut through by decades of runoff finally gave way, and 40 feet of bank collapsed into the channel and sent a wall of muddy water and topsoil down toward the creek. At 3:30 on the Kellerman farm, 2 properties over, Merl Kellerman stood on his back porch in the pouring rain in a yellow slicker and watched a fence line come apart in the wind. A section of his lower pasture, the section that ran alongside the drainage ditch he had never planted, went underwater in the space of 20 minutes. When the water receded 3 days later, it would take with it more than 8 inches of topsoil across nearly 2 acres. At 4 in the morning, on the Marsh farm north of the Hollister place, a section of drainage ditch that ran through the corner of a 120-acre cornfield failed. The bank sheared away. The runoff cut a new channel sideways through the crop, and by dawn a full row of freshly planted corn would be visible in brown streaks running east toward the creek. At 5 in the morning, the rain began to slacken. By 6 it had stopped. The gray of dawn came slow through a low ceiling of retreating cloud. Cal Hollister put on his boots and his barn coat and his hat, and he walked out the back door alone. He did not tell Willa where he was going. She knew. She sat by the window and watched him cross the yard in the wet gray light. and she watched him turn east and walk down the long gravel drive toward the ditch, and she did not follow. This was his walk to take. He walked slowly. The gravel was soft under his boots. The air smelled of wet earth and cut grass, and the particular mineral smell of a storm that has just moved through. Somewhere off to the north, a rooster crowed once and then again. Cal reached the north end of the ditch. He stopped. He looked. The switchgrass was bent low. Some of it was flattened. The big blue stem at the top of the bank had taken the worst of the wind and lay in swirling patterns like a boy's hair after a hard sleep. Water still ran through the channel, running fast and dark, but running clear. Running clear. Cal Hollister stood at the north end of the ditch for a long time. Then he began to walk. He walked south along the bank, following the length of the ditch through the low ground. He walked past the section where the collapse had happened 4 years ago. He walked past the section where his father had once 45 years earlier planned to plant grass and been stopped by his own father. He walked past the section where a 9-year-old girl had knelt in cold mud at 5 in the morning, 3 springs running, and pressed seedlings into the earth with her bare hands. He walked the full length, 1,500 feet of ditch. The bank held, every foot of it. The soil was wet, the soil was heavy, but the soil was where it had been the day before, and the day before that, and 3 years before that. The runoff had come through. The 7 inches of rain had come through, and the dark, rich topsoil of the Hollister farm, the soil that Owen Hollister had bought, and Silas Hollister had tried to save, and Cal Hollister had spent his adult life working, was still there. Every grain of it. Cal reached the south end of the ditch, where it emptied into the low corridor that ran toward Middle Creek. He stood there. He did not cry. Cal Hollister was not a man who cried. He was a man who had learned from a father, who had learned from his own father, that a man's face did not move much in the face of hard things. It was a poor kind of teaching. But it was the teaching he had been given, and he carried it the way men of his generation and his region carried most things, without complaint and without examination. He stood at the south end of the ditch for 20 minutes. He did not move. He looked at the water running clear. Then he turned and walked back up the long slope of the drive toward the farmhouse, and the sun broke through the low clouds behind him, and it lit the wet grass on the bank of the ditch until it shone. Willa was at the kitchen table when he came in. She had the water book open. She had a pencil in her hand. She was writing the water level at 6:15 in the morning, measured from the reference stake she had driven into the bank 3 years earlier. Cal took off his hat. He hung his coat on the peg. He walked to the table and pulled out the chair across from her, and he sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Cal said, "I should have asked you sooner." Willa did not look up from the notebook. She finished the entry she was writing. She set the pencil down. She looked at her father. 3 years ago, Cal said. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "I should have asked you 3 years ago what you were doing out there." Willa looked at him. She was 12 years old. She was wearing her grandfather's flannel shirt. Her braid had come loose in the night, and her hair fell around her face. "You know now," she said. That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. Cal sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, and he pulled out something small and dark and metal. He set it on the table between them. It was a brass surveyor's compass, the kind that folded closed like a pocket watch. The brass was tarnished to a deep, warm brown. The face was scratched. On the back, engraved in a spidery hand that must have been done by a jeweler in Des Moines, almost 90 years earlier, were 3 letters and a date. O.H. 1938. Owen Hollister, the year he bought the land. Willa looked at it. She did not touch it. She had never seen it before. "Your great-grandfather used this," Cal said, "when he walked this property line with the county surveyor in the spring of 1938. He carried it in his pocket every day of his working life. When he died, my father took it. When my father died, I took it." He paused. "It sat in a drawer in my bedroom for 18 years. Willa still did not move. "Your great-grandfather," Cal said, "told your grandfather he could not plant grass on the bank of that ditch in 1978. My father told me the story once. He never told me again." Willa looked up at her father. "Your great-grandfather was wrong," Cal said. "Your grandfather was right. You are right." He pushed the compass across the table. "This is yours now." Willa reached out. She picked up the compass. It was heavier than it looked. She felt the smooth, worn brass under her fingers warm from her father's pocket. She opened the cover. The needle inside quivered, then settled, pointing north through the kitchen window, toward the low ground where the ditch was. She closed the cover. She held it in her palm. "Thank you," she said. Cal Hollister did not answer. He got up from the table. He walked to the sink. He put his hands on the edge of the counter, and he stood there for a long time with his back to his daughter. And his shoulders shook once, and then they were still. Willa did not look up. She let her father have his moment. She had learned from watching him for 12 years when not to look. 4 days after the storm on a Saturday morning, Merl Kellerman drove up the Hollister Drive in his old Ford pickup. He parked in the yard. He did not come to the porch. He got out of the truck and stood in the gravel with his cap in his hand, and he waited. Cal saw him from the kitchen window. He walked out. Willa followed. The two men stood in the yard for a moment. Merl looked at Cal. Cal looked at Merl. Nothing was said. Then Merl turned to Willa. He was a big man. He had a face weathered by 60 years of Iowa sun. He held his cap in both hands in front of him, and he looked at the 12-year-old girl in her grandfather's flannel shirt. And he cleared his throat once. "Willa," he said, "I've been wrong about you for 3 years." Willa did not answer. She was not going to help him. "I said things about what you were doing out there," Merl said. "In the diner, on the road, to my wife. I said them because I thought I knew better than you. I didn't." He looked down at his cap. "My lower pasture is gone," he said. 2 acres, topsoil right down to clay. I lost a fence line and a section of pasture, and I don't know how long it's going to take to get that back." He looked up again. "Your ditch held." Willa nodded once. "I came over here to ask you." Merl said, "If you would show me what you did, and how I should do it on my place." Willa looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come with me." She walked past him toward the drive. Cal did not follow. He watched his daughter, 12 years old, in his father's flannel shirt, walk Merl Kellerman down the long gravel drive toward the ditch. And he watched her stop at the north end and gesture at the bank and begin to explain what she had done and why. He could not hear the words from that distance. He did not need to. He knew what she was saying. She was telling Merl Kellerman about root depth. She was telling him about friction and velocity and the way water behaved when it was forced to slow down. She was telling him about switchgrass and big bluestem and eastern gamma grass. She was telling him that stopping a flood was impossible, but changing the way water moved through a landscape was not. She was telling him what Silas Hollister had known in 1978, what Emmett Rourke had known in 1962, what Owen Hollister might have known too if he had lived long enough to see what 100 years of row cropping did to the soil his son and his grandson and his great-granddaughter would inherit. She was telling him what none of them had been able to say out loud until now. Merl Kellerman stood at the edge of the ditch with his cap in his hands and listened to a 12-year-old girl explain soil conservation to him, and he did not interrupt. Not once. That summer, Marsh drove out to the Hollister farm 3 times. He brought other farmers with him. He brought a soil scientist from Hollister. He brought a photographer from the county extension office. He took pictures of the bank and of the water, and of Willa standing at the north end of the ditch in her grandfather's flannel shirt.
When I was young, I chased
She did not give speeches. She answered questions when they were asked. She helped 2 other families that summer choose the right species for their bank village. She walked the length of the Marsh property with Dell.
So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every
She wrote a
winding
2-page
road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow.
A local reporter from the
Becoming must walk where harder paths may
The
go.
article ran on the front page of the county
Was never meant to be easy.
The girl who
The
thought
storm
Warren
was
County
never
listen to the water. Willa did not read the article. She did not need to. She had been reading the water for 6 years. That fall on Saturday, Willa knelt at the north end of the beach with a 7-year-old girl on the mountain. The girl's name, she had come up with a Switchgrass, and she had asked him specifically whether Willa would show her how to plant. Willa had said yes. She knelt in the cold earth with June. She showed her how to measure. She showed her how to plant.
Broken, I've known fear that stole my breath. I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher. Every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread.
He had asked Willa to She had asked him to carry her and walk the dog, because that was what her great He carried it every day. Above them, high in the pale October sky, a flock of geese started in a long rapid, calling to one another. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb. Since long before the tall grass prairie had been 6 feet of trees. The prairie had held modern counties.
One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye.
The wind came up soft from the south and moved through the dry stems of the switchgrass along the bank. And the sound of that dry paper whispering was the sound of a prayer. The greatest harvest that year.
The storm was never meant to end.
It was not so.
The battles were not sent to break me. They were sent to shape the man I am. Every trial is part of the journey. Every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason I can ride. The thunder finds me again. And dark clouds gather in the sky. I'll greet them like old companions, because they belong.
Willa Hollister understood that before most adults on Caldwell Road had ever thought to ask a question. And in the end, they did, one by one, cap in hand, to learn.